Hey guys, welcome to video number 2 for chapter 32. And in this one, we're going to be talking about struggles in Africa. Now, we've talked in previous chapters how imperialism, ethnic conflicts, and corrupt governments have contributed to many African nations being well below the wealth of other parts of the world. This video will look at how, even though many African nations gained their independence from Europe after World War II, stability and unity were really hard to achieve. Many African nations suffered internal conflicts, as you can see from the pictures here. Case in point, the first example we'll be looking at South Africa. Move picture of me back over here. Yeah. Now, South Africa achieved self-rule from Great Britain in 1910, so way before the rest of Africa achieved its independence. But really, that only benefited the white population. You see, South Africa is a pretty unique case in world history in that the minority ruled over the majority. Whites made up only about 20% of the population, but controlled everything through a system known as apartheid. Now, apartheid is a system that officially segregated South African society according to race. It broke South Africa into basic racial categories. All right, you've got blacks, you've got coloreds, you've got Asians, and then whites, obviously. So those are your four main categories. Whites were people, for lack of a better word, pure European descent, blacks, Africans. Asians were people from Asia, obviously, but mostly Indian, and coloreds were people of mixed race. Regardless, anybody outside of white was considered to be non-white. And the separation between all the races, it ensured white control. Non-whites faced a lot of restrictions. They had to carry passes with them at all times. They weren't allowed to travel freely in their own country. If they didn't have these passes on them, they could be arrested. They could be beaten or accosted by the police. Marriage between races was banned. Blacks couldn't own land in many areas. They were paid less than whites. And then there was the segregation, right? Whether it was drinking fountains, whether it was restaurants, schools, even beaches, right, that had white-only areas. They were all segregated. Now, in response to this, blacks in South Africa formed the African National Congress, or the ANC. It opposed apartheid and wanted equal treatment for non-whites. The ANC organized marches, boycotts, strikes, things of that nature. It was banned, though, after the Sharpeville massacre in 1960. Sharpeville was a prison where there was a massive demonstration, and police opened fire, killing 69 people. It got very, very ugly and violent. This led ANC leaders to shift from nonviolent to more armed resistance. Now, chief among these leaders was Nelson Mandela. Mandela started out as a peaceful protester, but he became more militant, meaning a little bit more extreme in his views and more willing to use violent measures after Sharpeville. And he was engaged in somewhat the South African government considered to be terrorist activities. He bombed factories and things of that nature. In 1962, he was arrested and sentenced to life in prison. He did not serve the rest of his life, but he did stay in jail for 27 years. Now, eventually, pressure from within South Africa and from other countries convinced the South African government to end apartheid. Many countries, including the U.S., imposed economic sanctions, meaning cutting off trade with South Africa. There were also massive boycotts in countries like Great Britain, the United States, throughout Europe and so forth. In 1990, South African President F.W. de Klerk decided apartheid should end. The following year, he freed Mandela. You see a picture of de Klerk on the left, Mandela on the right. Mandela, obviously a much older man than when he went into prison 27 years prior to it. And then in 1994, all races in South Africa were given the ability to vote freely in elections, and Mandela was elected as the first black president of South Africa. Now, the end of apartheid did not solve all the problems. Whites still controlled most of the land and wealth, and black poverty and unemployment remained very high. These problems wouldn't result in the bloodshed like in other countries, though. Ethnic conflicts killed millions of people in other African countries. There are two regions that we're going to discuss, and both saw horrible, horrible atrocities. The first one is Rwanda. Now, Rwanda is a small nation in Central Africa. With two main ethnic groups, just left it there, the Hutus and the Tutsis. Now, Tutsis were the minority. Screw this up here. All right, in any event, we'll get you caught up. So here's Rwanda, as I said, very, very small country in Central Africa, right next to the DNC, the DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo. It's in what they call the Great Lakes region. There we go. That's what I meant to put up there before. We've got the Tutsi and the Hutu. This was from a book published by Europeans in the early 1900s. And Tutsis were believed to be, or they were considered to be, racially superior because on average they were a little taller, and Europeans claimed that they had lighter skin and more European type features. You see how the Hutu was a little shorter, darker of skin, had more kind of African features in the face as well. Most of this was made up by the Europeans, right? They wanted to create racial separation within Rwanda. But because the Tutsis were given the higher status, they dominated Rwanda for decades. And obviously, Hutus resented the power that the Tutsis were given. In 1994, tensions boiled over, and Hutu extremists started instigating mobs to kill Tutsis. This was instigated by the assassination of the president, which was blamed on the Tutsis, and that really just poured a big bucket of gasoline all over the flames. And this led to genocide. And over the next 100 days, really horrible atrocities took place. Hutu mobs killed more than 800,000 Tutsis. And the weapon of choice, machetes, which is a very blunt, brutal instrument. It was meant for clearing brush through jungle areas, and it became symbolic of ethnic war in Africa at this time. Another 3 million people lost their homes. It created a huge refugee crisis. Finally, after several months, France sent in troops to stop the killing. But many of the Hutu leaders were put on trial and convicted, although the damage to the country was done. And you still have an awful lot of problems, that carried over to this day. The other region that has seen horrific conflict in recent years is Sudan. Now, Sudan was ethnically divided. You see today how you have Sudan and then South Sudan. 15 years ago, there was no South Sudan, okay? All of this was Sudan. It was all one country. Today, South Sudan is a separate country because of this conflict. Northern Sudan was mostly Arab and Muslim, right? So these would be people from Northern Sudan. And then you have people from Southern Sudan who are more of your traditional Black African. And they're a mix of religions. You've got Christian, you've also more traditional African religions as well. Now, the North, more Arab Muslim population, they controlled the government and, most importantly, they controlled the oil supply. And this gave them all the power. The South resented this power and Northern dominance, as well as attempts of the North to impose Islamic law on them. They said, we're not Muslims, so why should we have to listen to Islamic law? And this led to resistance movements, okay, and eventually to outright civil war. Now, war and famine that followed killed millions in the 1980s and 1990s. The conflict ended in 2004, but a new one began in Sudan's western region of Darfur, right? So here's where Darfur is in Sudan's western region, this area over here. Arab militias, known as Janjaweed, they were backed by the Sudanese government, and they would attack non-Arab villages, sometimes wiping them out. In horrible, brutal conflicts. Hundreds of thousands were driven from their land, creating a huge refugee crisis that Africa and other areas are still seeing the effects of to this day. Okay, so an overview over some of the issues that Africa has been dealing with in the 21st century, including political issues in South Africa and ethnic issues. And then for the next one, we're going to be getting into an even more complex and conflicted region of the Middle East.